Hey there folks, the number one Sprain fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Alexander Gregory Kent record, Teaches Dust to Reason. If you are an individual who participates in online music nerd kind of spaces, online music discussion, so on and so forth, then knowingly or not, chances are you are probably aware of the limited yet extraordinarily noteworthy body of work that Alex Kent has been working on over the course of the past handful of years, most notably thanks to his band Sprain, the now dissolved no-wave noise rock, somewhat unclassifiable band that put out their massively beloved sophomore studio album The Lamb as Effigy last year before breaking up shortly thereafter, thus resulting in one of the most mysterious and one of the most critically acclaimed albums of the entirety of last year. And personally, I ranked it as among the best records of any kind last year. Truly one of those magnum opus albums, and it feels kind of fitting that the band didn't continue on after that record. I can't really see how they would have topped it as a collective. Thankfully, though, the end of Sprain did not mean the end of Alexander Gregory Kent, more often known by the shortened form of his name, Alex Kent. And now here we are with his first full-length solo studio album, Teaches Dust to Reason. And while he may be working on other projects right now, most notably his new band Shearling, which has yet to release a proper studio debut, for the time being, this is a pretty phenomenal direction for him to go in, with a huge amount of drone and ambient-based direction being taken on this record that somehow makes complete and total sense based on his prior works, yet at the same time coming across as something entirely unexpected in the best way possible. Kent's previous work never saw him be a stranger to the free improv side of things within the realm of the avant-garde, and that is something that absolutely shows here with Teaches Dust to Reason 100% being a heavily improvisational record. And while that is somewhat of a dicey thing at times depending on the artist, as some people just simply aren't capable of really improvising as successfully or as efficiently as others, Alex Kent has proven in the past that he is more than capable of creating some of the most devastating sounds that you've ever heard on the fly, and I don't really think that changes very much here. And in a sense, tonally speaking, I actually do think that Teaches Dust to Reason could be very, at times at least, heavily compared to previous works that Kent has been a part of, with this very looming, ominous presence throughout the entirety of the record, these very massive feelings of build-up throughout the entirety of extensively long tracks. But to that same extent, I also feel that this record is somewhat of a reinvention for himself, stylistically speaking. The way that this record is composed is completely different to anything else that he's done, being much more immediate in terms of the way that it is presented to the listener, with the title track opening up this two-track record with an immediate wave of harsh noise, thus presenting this record as something that is immediately in the face of the listener rather than something that takes time to build up before exploding into a grand bit of industrial, almost semi-gothic brutality. It really does feel like this album is taking a different path, and I really like to see that from an artist like Kent, because it means that he's not only capable of providing an extremely intense atmosphere in a very unique context, but he's great at doing that in the context of multiple different creative avenues, while also maintaining his core sound and never really betraying the traits that make him such a unique artist at present moment. It's really great to see this album change things up for him while at the same time maintaining a lot of his best qualities. And to clarify, this isn't a harsh noise album through and through or anything like that. This isn't like Kazimoto Endo or Merzbow or anything like that. This is just a record that starts off that way. Rather, the majority of the album feels oddly serene, yet at the same time extraordinarily depressing in a very bizarre kind of way, thus allowing for this very disorienting feel to permeate throughout the record in a lot of ways. The album itself heavily focusing on these ambient and drone-like tendencies that I personally think are pulled off extraordinarily well here. There aren't many albums like Teaches Dust to Reason that can successfully manage to take a pretty singular sound across two tracks for an hour and run with it, while at the same time providing a huge amount of variety to that singular sound. That isn't really to say that there are very few good drone or ambient albums out there. Of course there are, but it does feel like for the most part there are a lot of classic drone and ambient records that mainly focus on a singular idea and run with it. Rather, Teaches Dust to Reason has a singular sound, but a variety of ideas going on within it, and they all manage to blend together extraordinarily well. The majority of the rest of the title track actually takes up a bit more of a sort of fantastical, mystical kind of tone, which is, again, executed extraordinarily well with a lot of very natural subtleties about it that ensure it never really feels particularly pre-planned in a way that would come across as artificial or anything like that. Once again, very obviously relying on a more improvisational nature, which is great to see. And then at the end of the track, we resume those noise-based activities that we saw at the very beginning that introduce the listener to Teaches Dust to Reason. And it's an interesting way to wrap back around to that initial idea that was first presented to the listener, while also at the same time incorporating new elements in it that allow it to kind of feel like a completely different passage that's only comparable to the beginning of the track, with a lot of those midpoint influences that, again, come across as more subtle, a lot more ambient focused, ambient forward, if you will, being incorporated into that wall of noise, making it feel even more textured, making it feel like it's an even more unique piece of the puzzle here. And in turn, it kind of feels like the entire track is just one unique idea after the next, and said ideas just happen to bleed from one to the next very well and very naturally. The second and final track of the record, the nearly 30-minute long Horse Goes to Heaven, is sort of equally unique in its own way, but a lot of the track is doing feels entirely indifferent towards what was being done on the aforementioned title track, yet at the same time, again, a lot of similar ideas are being taken up here. It's just that they're being completely reworked into something new for the context of a new track, with the second track, again, Horse Goes to Heaven, heavily working with a more traditionally ambient style throughout the first handful of minutes of it, a lot of these very warbling, rising, and falling moments, and then eventually it manages to evolve into a very church-like kind of sound, a very distorted, absolutely the worst, most terrible organ that you've ever heard, and I mean that in the best way possible. It sounds like a church that's melting, and it's a wonderful sound to hear. And in turn, I feel that this record is really, especially in those moments, given a very ethereal quality. At least I think I speak for a few people when I say that a lot of the more mystical and kind of strange, surreal sides of a lot of church-related and religion-related topics, like, again, organ-esque kind of sounds, can make for a very intense and very strange listening experience, one that can definitely disorient, while maintaining that minimalism that you might kind of expect to dissipate by that point in the record. And I think that's exactly what happens here. It's an album that manages to take those sounds, continue the minimalism of them throughout the various directions that it goes in, with the sort of, again, very kind of holy kind of sounds going on, yet at the same time it also becomes something that is hugely ethereal, feels larger than itself. It's just a really impressive thing to hear compositionally and stylistically. The record ends off with probably some of the most minimalistic material on the entire album, and that's saying something because pretty much every single note here is very singular and on its own, a lot of things being hugely drawn out over the course of the entire record, but in a good and very emotionally effective kind of way, with the end of the album, the last handful of minutes coming across as especially cold, especially bleak, especially hollow, but in a way that elicits a fairly visceral emotional reaction from the listener, or at the very least from myself. I can't help but feel that in those last few minutes, this record really does manage to establish itself as something that is capable of creating a massive emotional swell within the listener, while at the same time never overworking itself and becoming too heavily complex, and in turn doing away with that emotional effectiveness. It's nice to see this album, especially in those last moments, really realize just how great it is at being a minimalistic listening experience. There are a lot of albums like this that can't quite capture that same magic with similar ideas, and it's all the more impressive that Alex Kent was absolutely able to do exactly that. And one of the most impressive parts about the entirety of Teaches Dust to Reason is the way in which it takes this idea of minimalism, sticks to it, yet at the same time provides enough detail and enough intricacies that it never feels like a record that was just thrown together with the idea of improvisational style in mind. I mean, the very low-key, grumbling kind of noise stringing itself along after about the three-quarter point of the title track before finally leaving the record in the final moments of the second track, while at the same time managing to nonetheless have its presence felt throughout the entire thing as I stated before, looming ominous presence is extraordinarily interesting to hear here, as well as the very subtle vocal work that kicks in about a half hour into this thing that you basically don't even recognize upon a more casual listen, with it adding yet another texture to an album that is already built upon layers of very intense and extremely complex sounding noise that is nonetheless, again, based around minimalism. There's also the sort of semi-folky influences that you get throughout this record in the more restrained kind of passages, which is really nice to see as it effectively creates this aura of naturalness surrounding the record, as a lot of ambient music is kind of tending to lean towards, which isn't a bad thing whatsoever. I think that it works extremely well here. It kind of harkens towards Kent's other solo project, Big Brown Cow, with the sort of avant folk tendencies that are taken up on that project. I digress. I think that generally speaking, this album manages to take a variety of ideas that are extraordinarily subtle and combine them all together with a plethora of noise influences, ambient influences, drone influences, until it creates something that feels like it doesn't really represent any of that, but rather a much larger thing than any of those things ever could be individually on their own in the context of an album like this. You know, I do think it's funny, when Sprain initially announced that they were breaking up after the massive amounts of hype surrounding the Lamb as effigy, a lot of people were disappointed, of course, but I also think that with the announcement of Kent's follow-up band, Shearling, that Sprain were dead and buried, and that the reborn concept, the reborn project, would be the aforementioned Shearling. However, while that may be true, at least to an extent, I also can't help but feel with the release of this record that maybe Kent's solo work is just as much, if not even more, worth looking towards. Teaches Dust to Reason is easily one of the best drone/ambient-oriented records that I've heard in a pretty fair amount of time, honestly. I mean, it's a difficult listen, no question, but that kind of comes with the territory of this sort of thing, and if you are willing to lend it an ear and give it an honest, genuine shot, I think you'll find this to be one of the most impressive soundscapes of the year so far. I'm going to give this record 4 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that's the end of this album review. Thanks for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.